Hello strategy gaming enthusiasts, my name is AlzaboHD, and in today's challenge video, we will seek to restore the Celtic culture and revive paganism, the rarest religion in CK3. In both starting dates, this religion is extinct, and the Celtic cultures are set to be conquered, but what if we could get clover these difficulties? In this campaign, we will start as an obscure count of Pictish persuasion, break out of Britain, unearth an extinct religion, and avoid dropping the ball while conquering Gaul. And speaking of balls, this video is sponsored by Manscaped.com. Your body, butt, and balls will have it all with the Manscaped Perfect Package 4.0. And the folks over at Manscaped hooked me up to ensure that map-staring enthusiasts can dev up their hygiene. In this package, you can benefit from the lawnmower trimmer that has an LED light, technology that eliminates the chances of castration, and benefits from a wireless and waterproof design so that you can shave in the shower. Powering this potent portable is easy with its wireless charging system, and it has a travel lock feature so that TSA stays away. This package also includes the Unball-leavable Crop Preserver Ball Deodorant and Crop Reviver Toner Spray. And if you're feeling ballsy, you can also use the included Magic Mat to keep your hair from going everywhere. Be sure to check out Manscaped.com today and get 20% off, free international shipping, and 2 free gifts by using the promo code AlzaboHD at checkout. Our campaign commences with Count Ciniod of Pictland, a decidedly bland 26-year-old man of shady disposition. The Ciniod clan had long since abandoned their Pictish roots, but in 867, our count reverted to his indigenous culture to become the cultural head of the most obscure people in the game. Of course, his pitiful prestige could barely afford a retinue worthy of name, but all the same, Ciniod would use this malnourished militia to declare independence from his de jure duke. Our count made rapid gains and conquered High Duke Aid's counties with ease, but in spite of these advances and a decisive victory in the battle for Banff, Ciniod's capital was captured and our count was sent to prison in disgrace. With no chance of getting off scot-free, our bad luck baron tried to escape and became mortally wounded, forcing him to pay for his own ransom. If at first you don't succeed, break truce like Robert the Bruce and insist on independence. At this point, Ciniod's dishonor was immeasurable and his fame was ruined, but before he could get clover it, things got even worse. Viking invaders led by Count Highstein declared war on the sovereign of Scotland, and although Duke Aid was unmade as the sovereign of our Scotsmen, Ciniod would need further aid to survive this Viking raid. Even with a brave heart, survival was looking slim for our protagonist of Pictland. In fact, he was little more than a walking corpse, and his forces were outnumbered 10-1 before the battle had begun. Even the Pope wanted to take away Ciniod's concubines, and the Count couldn't catch a break. In an effort to survive, Ciniod sought to treat his wounds and encountered a foreign faith alongside his foreign physician. It turned out that the Norse gods were cool with concubines, and Ciniod had his nurse teach a sitaru to his 7 spawnlings. At long last, he could finally catch a break, as he had the Viking Count murdered, and was left with only a 2-year-old toddler as his opposition. Scotland was salted into the earth, his spawnlings embraced Norse worth, and it was best to buy time to let his sovereign and the Vikings kill each other. Any interloper was summarily impaled, and King Constantine won the war against Highstein's horde. In an effort to honor his king, Ciniod hosted a feast, bon appetit, though at some point he'll have to eat Ciniod's poisoned croissant, or sleep with spiders. But they say 3rd time's the charm, and King Constantine croaked his last breath. Ciniod now had an opportunity to declare independence, and in 879 he rose arms against the new child King Corban. His foray into the capital of Moray proved easy, and after a decisive battle at Peter's Head, the previous potentate's resistance petered out. 3 years of war had scored Ciniod freedom at last, but he had sinned so severely that his soldiers wouldn't follow his orders to consolidate the counties. In effect, he just couldn't declare war due to children's bodies hitting the floor. He'd have to wait a little while longer to subjugate his Scottish sovereign, but when it was possible, Pictish victory was all but a guarantee. In 888 AD, Crinan was at last crowned as King of Pictland, and in the coming years, Strathclyde slid into his sovereignty. Jarls took suspicious falls, Lothian was leveled, and in one decisive battle, Suðuroyar belonged to the new Scottish sovereign. The dragon of Celtic nationalism had awoken at last, and it was time to revoke the holdings of heretics, and soon only our sovereign spawnlings of Asatru faith were given land. At the wise age of 59, Crinan was feeling far from fine, and was almost dead from the stress of living in Scotland. Separatist swine would dine in hell, but Crinan was decidedly unwell, but at the very least he felled the last of his Pictish protesters. His dying breath moved the capital to Gowrie, but all work and no play gave our Celtic crownhead a heart attack, and he died at the age of 61. The polity of Pictland thus passed down to his primary son and heir, Ciniod, the 7-year-old child. Ciniod was not your average adolescent, and his reign would forever change the course of history. As a Catholic child, he had first heard of Norse paganism through his mother, and took to the teachings while ironically plotting the destruction of the last Norse holdout of the Northlands. His true faith had now taken shape, and by 905 CE, Pictland was united, Christian heretics were fatally elided, and the fate of Northumbria was all but decided. Ciniod had finally come of age as a mastermind philosopher, and married an equally intelligent maiden to iron out his bloodline. And speaking of iron, the Norse only want one thing, and it's disgusting, but Ciniod had to pay for peace. No mercy was afforded to Mercia, which became a part of Pictland, which itself had not use of Gaelic pretenses and embraced the Celtic cross. Across the sea, the Irish fiefdoms lay in Flanders Field, which was great, since Ciniod could now embark into the island of Ayr unopposed. Ulster fell to Celtic colonization, the east of Ireland was lit on fire, and nary a man could take a stand. In fact, Ireland was entirely subjugated, and I wish it went differently, but our Celtic crownhead found himself a cuck. Northumbria was struck, Catholic Cumbrians and Irish Insularites led an insurrection, and the United Celtic Kingdoms were anything but united. Perhaps smelling blood in the water, Northman Vikings soon made it into a four-way fray, but Ciniod would pay to win, and the rebels turned rebel in Inverness. By 927, Ayr had almost entirely bent the knee to Ciniod's decree, and attention would soon turn southwards. The lands of Gaul had the gall to lay independent of our expanding emirate, and it was time for Ciniod to liberate these previously pagan principalities by invading the kingdom of Bertrand. In 18 months, French forces forfeited and the king was captured, leaving the lands in Celtic hand. At long last, the Christian Carling dynasty was exterminated, and the lands were peopled with Pictish protagonists, and those that remained were forced to convert to Nordic paganism. Paris was renamed in honor of the heathen hero that stood against Rome, and soon became home of Ciniod's capital crownland. Irish Flanders was next to fall, and whole swaths of England were simultaneously secured for our sovereign. Resistance was futile, and between breaking back Breton advances and routing religious rebels, Ciniod forged the kingdoms of Ireland and France, which were restored and renamed into Ayr and Gaul. Back in Gaul, the fate of Brittany was decided in 939, and in one decisive battle, the kingdom of Breche was brought back into the Celtic fold, and Wales and Ireland would soon follow suit. England was picked apart by Pictland, kingdom titles were forged, and Britannia was restored to the previously pagan polity of Britannia. By this point, Ciniod held sovereignty over 5 kingdom titles, but outside of the capital, his lands were neither Pictish nor Norse pagan. In fact, an entirely different culture soon converged, as Celtic colonists merged with their French followers, ultimately forming the Gaulois culture. These Gallicized Gaels demanded blood for the blood gods, and piety poured from the prisons of state. As for Britain's fate, 956 marked the date that it fell entirely under Ciniod's control. But Ciniod was getting older, not as old as this guy, but still he needed to act now or never, as he wouldn't live forever. Norse gods were low-key, demanding in blood sacrifices, and the ways of his pagan predecessors brought him to proclaim a change in faith. The only problem is that paganism has holy sites spread across Germany, Estonia, Egypt, India, and Chagatai. To this end, Ciniod flanked the Germanic fiefdoms of the HRE, and in 18 months, Westphalia was now East Pictlandia, and the holy site of Paderborn was brought under pagan protection. Only a land bridge could secure these disparate duchies, and Ciniod carried his country through Lorraine, Luxembourg, and Friesland, though his time was fast running out. This legendary leader was undeterred and forged an empire from the countless Celtic kingdoms across Celtica, and embarked on holy wars for the holy sites of Estonia and the Isles of Sardinia. With a divine decree, paganism was at last reforged in 963 AD, and Ciniod gave it Gaul to Mother Earth. All vassals were bade to convert, all 161 of them, but before they received our sovereign summons, Ciniod's corpse returned to Mother Earth at the age of 69. In time, this King of Kings would be worshipped as the uniter of Britannia, liberator of Gaul, and the architect of the first Celtic cultured and pagan-faithed empire in the world. Ciniod's son and heir Naiton would ascend to the imperial throne, but with his realm divided, his efforts might be misguided. Naiton's holdings lay neglected of any important inheritance, and he was forced to murder his nephew King Krupp to inherit the kingdoms of Provania and Breige. But Naiton's realm was not the only thing divided, as the faith of his fiefdom was far from united. He requested his vassals to submit to paganism, but he had to pay them in favors. This wayward son was forced to carry on his late father's wars into Estonia and Sardinia, but soon Icelandic invaders were at his throat and forced the fiefdom into a forefront war. Just as things couldn't get any worse, the dastardly Duke of Orléans launched a demand that Naiton cede the nation to himself. A task failed successfully. The island of Saaremaa was secured, and thus the second holy site of paganism was procured. To his south, war dragged on for another year, but Sardinia subsequently surrendered and afforded him the diplomatic distance needed to liberate Sinai for the pagan faith. Over the subsequent years, Icelandic invaders were banished from Britain, Celtic conquests resulted in contiguous continental counties, Norse raiders were banished a second time, and a foul felled our figurehead at his feast. Only 6 years into his reign, and Naiton was dead to rights, though he was famous for his final patty. Naiton passed off his polity to his 24-year-old son and heir, Rudri I. Rudri was in for a rude awakening, as his only inheritance and sole holding was a tribal backwater in Northern Ireland. He had to murder his siblings to secure something, anything to maintain the power needed to last more than 1 hour. A toast to King Yves led to more holdings indeed, but they were in Germany, and the crown capital yet lay in the clutch of the court chancellor. This chancellor, the King Canu, proceeded to launch a civil war against our rightful ruler on behalf of Rudri's sister Arnamatia, and to make matters worse, the Duke of Essex launched a civil war on behalf of his Clermontine cousin, and things got worse as Luxembourg declared independence while Anglo-Saxons sought their vengeance. These times of trouble necessitated white peace when and where Rudri was able, but war never changes, and peace rarely lasted. In fact, there were only 6 months of peace before Arnamatia's followers waged yet another war. While stressful, Luxembourg's loyalty was soon assured, and one by one, the fractious factions of our fiefdom came to bend the knee to Rudri. By 974, war was no more, and the imprisoned rebels were revoked of their land. The capital of Vercingetorix once again belonged under direct Celtic and crown control, and was renamed to honor Ciniod the Conqueror. Celtica now stretched contiguously across the continent, and Rudri's raiders reappropriated East Frankish fiat. These funds established the first pagan holy order, and across the polder, Rudri's ambitions grew bolder. Our pagan people yearned for a return to nature, embraced forest fighting, and set about procuring the third pagan holy site in Sinai. But Sinai was defended by this guy, Caliph Malik, who, as head of the largest Muslim emirate, was now in direct conflict with the largest pagan polity in the world. Celtic and countrymen crossed the sea and brought the sheik to his knee, and in the space of 2 years, Sinai was secured for our state, but a Northman invasion of Britain and a civil revolution required him to make Hastings back to his holdings. Hundreds of thousands of rebels broke out of the woodwork, but they too were routed, the Vikings deported, and the Irish impounded. Gaulois was growing across Gaul, and while Friesland was falling, Rudri couldn't get up, as he was agout the gout. With Friesland falling, it was time to invade East Francia, and, to be frank, the German troops were massively outclassed and outnumbered by the pagan principalities, and in barely a year, Rudri had doubled his landmass. These lands were given to Celtic members of the Crinan clan, who now ran the new kingdom of Helvetica. But rent was due, and Rudri ensured his tenants tipped their landlord. No Provence was safe from Celtic subjugation, and the faith of our nation would soon be shaken. You see, Rudri sought to codify the pagan beliefs, and launched a reformation at the dawn of the millennium, greatly increasing the militarization of his religion. In matters of state, Rudri centralized his country with maximum crown authority, which finally allowed him to feudalize his tribal holdings. It was the best of times and the worst of times, and while Rudri's court could at last have nice things, it was Times New Roman for the Pope to declare a crusade for Helvetica. Rudri had no choice but to break Burgundy in anticipation, but no one could anticipate the rebel Inquisition. Quite frankly, it's only 100,000 protesters, and maybe these Frenchmen could serve as fodder for the Catholic invaders. But then things got worse, and worse, and even worse. This decade of misery was wrought with agony and bloodshed, but the tides were turning, and the Catholic's cross would go no further. Christians shall not pass, and paganism was spreading at last, but the former French lands were far from united. While Rudri wrestled for control of Aquitaine, the High Druid called for a holy war that our sovereign was skeptical of joining. The Caliph had twice as many troops, and it just wasn't worth the trouble, but at least Rudri had made France Gaul once again. But there were doubts about Rudri's mortality, and after over 40 years of rule, he passed into Gaia's embrace at the age of 64. His grandson Geraud had now inherited the Celtic crown, and things were about to go down. It was now time for Jarod to rule as the 29-year-old emperor, but Celtic tradition dictated he inherited one of the most useless counties in the entire country. Jarod's interests included living, laughing, and letting the bodies hit the floor, and fiscal austerity was soon in store. In following French tradition, the population of his nation were permanently on strike, and the 28th Viking invasion was met with frustration. Jarod was far less subtle than his brother, and his familial fatalities resulted in unwanted attention, though the Gaulish culture had at last embraced its first tradition. And speaking of culture, our Brythonic brethren fell into the fold, and in 1012, the Pan-Celtican movement resulted in the cultural unification of all Celtic nations. But in family affairs, the allotment of inheritance was far from fair. Jarod challenged his aunt's claim to the county of Ciniod and beat her half to death with his mace. She was forced to revoke the kingdom of Ire, and after another benevolent beating, conceded her control over the capital of Ciniod. Paganism was proliferating across the polity, and was by now the third most followed faith in the entire world. Holes in his holdings were filled, his brother's bones found their way home, and G-Man set out to invade Italia. The so-called Romans would pay for setting our ancestors astray, and in the space of 2 years, they would follow the Celtic way. Jarod was now known as the Pendragon, and Britannia began the slow process of Celtic cultural conversion. Any remaining foreign-cultured characters would face extinction, even the younglings, and our shady sovereign sought about pummeling the papist pretender from the Italian peninsula. Christianity was collapsing under the power of our pan-Celtic country, and soon enough, Rome was snuffed. Pagan witches and warlocks moved into town and salted these sacred grounds, but halfway across the world, the Islamic Emirates had declared jihad upon our Sinai subjects. Jarod was unwilling to fight a battle against hundreds of thousands of mujahideen, and was thus forced to surrender the Sinai to Sunni sovereignty. This act only served to solidify the pagan faith and Celtic identity, and soon his subjects were replaced with offspring that proved more malleable. Further attempts to reclaim Christian counties were met with fire and fury, and the Pope watered our field with the blood of his heathen horde. By 1039, the Carlings were but a distant memory, and the constituent kingdoms of Celtica were reorganized to facilitate imperial inheritance. Over the following years, Mother Earth sought to reclaim clay from the Saracen sultanates, and the pagan world would enter into combat with the Ummah once again. Jarod personally led his druidic divisions into the Nile Delta, and in 4 years the Kasbah was rocked with the establishment of a pagan kingdom in Cairo. While this ephemeral emirate would crumble into the sands of time, the Crinan dynasty would live on forever, for the Archdruid himself had blessed them as the eternal defenders of Mother Earth and the protector of all pagan polities. All's well that ends Welsh, and in 1058 AD, the Celtic Continuum controls almost all of Western and Central Europe, including the entirety of Britannia and Italia. The ruling pan-Celtican culture, itself formed from Gaulois and Breton traditions, is geographically the largest in Western Europe and is present in 46 counties. This bellicose and Brythonic culture derives from our Pictish progenitors and features traits that underline our Celtic community. At the same time, the French are facing extinction, and the Gauls and the other Celtic countries are assimilating into the pan-Celtican pantheon. Our combination of Celtic cultures boasts 11 technologies into the early medieval era, and with only one away from high medieval hegemony, is more technologically advanced than any other culture in the world. In terms of faith, our pagan polity has single-handedly revived the religion of our ancestors, and have so successfully spread it that this once extinct religion is now the second most followed in the entire world, and when combined with its older variant, number nearly 400 counties of the true faith. The hegemony of House Crinan is undisputed and holds sway over the Celtically converted countries of Eire, Pictland, Wales, Britannia, Brege, Gaul, Celtae, Auvergnai, Helvetica, Belgae, Volcae, Boii, and Subria, Ligonia, and Sardinia, which together compose the Empire of Celtica. One of our Crinan cousins also holds a rump realm in Egypt, but the vast majority of our nearly 1,000-member dynasty reign as vassals in our massive mainland. Composed of 28 houses, the Crinan dynasty has a legendary legacy that has surpassed the Celtically converted and newly paganized Carling kings of old. Jarod, the Pendragon of Celtica, reigns supreme, and outside of his court capital in Ciniod, the world is quite different than that of our own timeline. No one expected the Iberian Islamicization, and no Christian countries exist in Spain. Estonia is Swedish, Novgorod is in Norway, Hungary is still a Taltoist tribe, Mordvinia is something I've never heard of before with a really obscure religion and hybrid culture, the Byzantine Empire has 3 times less of an army than we do despite our equal sizes, the Mohammedans dominate North Africa, and Scandinavia looks like something from Salvador Dali. Christendom is all but destroyed and only exists in the Catholic rump realms of Bohemia and the Orthodox state of the SPQR, while Islam and paganism proliferate throughout the rest of the known world. This is probably the largest empire we've ever created in CK3 for the channel, so feel free to drop a decree if you have any further ideas for me. Before ending the video, I'd like to thank you for watching this far and supporting our algorithmic overlords. If you'd like to see more strategy gaming content, declareth a like and bend the knee to subscription decree to let YouTube know you're a map-staring pro. This video was sponsored by Manscaped, and I invite you to check out the description box below to find out more information. If you want to fund further Celtic conquests, be sure to consider donating to our Patreon, or by donating basic attention tokens to AlzaboHD through the Brave browser. Ada Earn, and it's time now to roll the credits.